as a man, as a as a relatable human being, instead of this untouchable mythological historical figure. So Grant put his pants on one leg at a time. We need this is a great place that really allows Grant to be seen in a very human, fallible, relatable way. And I think, but it doesn't diminish his very admirable character traits. And in fact, just the opposite. I was mentioning that I believe it really explains much more. You grow to understand just how deep the reserves of perseverance, generosity, and these admirable character traits go with Ulysses S. Grant. And oops, let's get back to full screen there. And so, and that's what makes this place, special. Even though Grant spent a very short period of time here at that cottage on Mount McGregor, just north of Saratoga Springs, which of course was an international resort destination at the time. I was discussing how Grant, his life really revolved around his family. Some of the worst times that he spent mentally were when he was separated from his family throughout his life. And there was some painful, long separations prior to the Civil War. During the Civil War, he was separated at times from members of his family. And those were very, very difficult mental struggles for Grant. He was, again, hopelessly devoted to his family. And so after he arrives home from a 2.5-year world tour after his presidency, he's got to decide, along with his wife Julia, where they're going to settle. And they choose Midtown Manhattan in New York City. And that is where they're going to choose, really, and I don't know this for 100% sure, but it seems pretty obvious that they're living in that place is going to put them centrally located near where Grant's their 3 sons were living. Now, their one daughter, Nellie, had married an Englishman at the White House, and she moved to England, much to Grant's dismay. And so, unfortunately, he couldn't be close to her, but he could be close to his other children, and that was very important to him. And so that is why they're going to move into the brownstone that you see on the screen there. There's an interior shot. It's a very nice place. One of their friends of the family helped them to, purchase that, a man named George Childs out of Philadelphia. And so Grant is really going to settle down and come up with a way to make money. He had spent a lot on the world tour. His son had just got involved in Wall Street investments. His son, Ulysses Jr., they called him Buck. He was born in Ohio, the Buckeye State. So Buck is getting involved with a young man named Ferdinand Ward. And he's, some sort of an up-and-coming Wall Street phenom, this Ward character. And Grant, he was if Grant had a great weakness, it was being overly trusting. And that's where he gets into trouble here in the 1880s. After moving into New York, is he trusts this man, and his son trusts him, and really all the family members all invested heavily in this investment firm called Grant and Ward, and for a few years during the mid 1880s, I should say the early 1880s, Grant and his family are going to be very comfortable. Money is coming in plentifully, and there's plenty to go around. Grant is, living comfortably. He's providing for his children, and, there's a relaxed atmosphere. There's Grant, on top of all this, is able to have these family reunions at their summer home on the New Jersey seashore. It's really this kind of, the golden years for Grant, I guess. It lasted a few years, but, he was just absolutely in his element with his, some privacy, with his children, with his grandchildren, and that's what he loved to do, was spend time with them. And that is unfortunately really going to come crashing down. The investments he's been making, essentially Ward, their business partner, was running a Ponzi scheme. It's pretty much that simple, you know. And so that is what is going to come crashing down, is the realization of this, the exposure of this uh, scheme. And people will say, well, was it Grant's son's fault? Was it Grant's fault? Were they involved in this scheme? And the reality is, Grant and his son, there's no evidence that they were involved. They may have been naive, or had some, warning signs that they didn't recognize or should have taken heed of. But in all reality, they were not part of this. They weren't guilty of anything other than perhaps missing some warning signs. Now, the reason I say this is because when this scandal broke, um, it actually took quite a while to prosecute Ferdinand Ward, because there were other major investors that invested in Grant and Ward, and they didn't even want to come forward. They didn't even want to put their name out there in court because it made them look bad. So Grant wasn't the only one to, you know, be swindled by this young man, this Ferdinand Ward. But it certainly was a devastating blow, both to his ability to trust people and to his family's financial future. And these, as I was mentioning before, Grant, had those few good years. The money was coming in. That's him and his children in the 1880s, and grandchildren at the Long Branch, New Jersey cottage there on the seashore. So that's really the good years. And this is where the tragedy unfolds. Even before this whole unraveling of the Grant and Ward, you know, this whole debacle, which pretty much sent Wall Street into a panic in early 1884. Grant, the winter before, had slipped and fallen on the icy sidewalk in New York, and he had hurt his hip so bad. It was an old hip injury from the Civil War. Some of you may know that Grant was quite lame after a horseback riding injury after Vicksburg, and had to be, carried on a litter into Chattanooga. He was in, months later. So this old injury was re-injured, and he was bedridden for a while. And so he started off 1884 in a really terrible way physically. And this was just the beginning. That spring, the scandal broke about the Grant and Ward. And so Grant, it takes a minute for him to kind of, deal with all this. This is a massive issue, but he does what he always does. He doesn't get completely shaken. He turns around pretty quickly, and he says, "I have just got to do something for my family." That's he focuses on a solution instead of just wallowing in pity, or blaming everyone else. He just decides he's going to look for a solution. He'd been pestered for a long time to write anything about the Civil War. I mean, he was the central figure of the Civil War to many, and for him to write anything would have been gold for any publisher of any kind. And so Century Magazine had been one of the companies that had approached him most recently at the end of 1883. So he reaches back out to them. At the time he and other times he had refused. He finally reaches back out to him and says, I will consider this now. And so he starts writing articles, war articles for Century Magazine. And I think it was a Shiloh Wilderness, it was Shiloh, Vicksburg Wilderness, and I think Chattanooga was in there, Appomattox. I don't remember. They changed them around a little bit, but it was basically 4 articles. And even from the beginning, there was kind of a feeling that this would probably be just a precursor to working his way into a full-fledged memoir, which was just, so, I think everybody knew on both sides. Grant knew on his end, and the publishers knew on their end, this would turn into something bigger. And both were, willing for it to go that way. He knew making the small sum off of each article was just going to keep his family afloat for the summer of 1884. They had retreated to the New Jersey cottage for the summer, and that's where Grant started his writing career. So Grant's going to have something else occur right as he's starting to write these articles, becoming an author, he's going to have this terrible pain in his throat in June of '84, at the New Jersey Cottage, and he is just going to have this, again, terrible, instant pain in his throat. Thought he had swallowed an insect or that stung him or something. He didn't know what to make of it. A doctor took a look at it, said it might be something he may want to get looked at, but he kind of pushed it off for the rest of the summer, dealt with the pain that came and went. And finally, it wouldn't be till October that he would finally go and see the gentleman that's on the right-hand side of the screen there, and that is Dr. John Douglas, a throat specialist. He's going to be sent there from his regular doctor's office, and this guy is a throat specialist, and he doesn't, he knows his patient is General Grant. He knows he can't, parse words. He says, this is, basically cancerous. He doesn't beat around the bush too much. He tries to give some hopeful tone to it and say it might be able to be cured, but the prognosis was pretty serious right off the bat. And Grant, this is really where Grant's going to find out that his time may be limited at this point. It's not 100% sure, but this book project is no longer, I'm sorry, the writing project, which is quickly turning into a book project, is going to, going to have to be put on fast forward if he's going to make sure it's going to be done, if his health is going to continue to deteriorate. So this becomes a race against time as he gets into deciding to write his memoirs, which happens essentially around that time as he's leaving Long Branch and going back to New York for the winter. And so that's really for most people, that's going to be a crushing blow. I mean, Grant is going to find out they have cancer, and in that era, again, there was some cancer treatments, but it was cancer of certain types of cancer were essentially a death sentence at that time, that are sometimes now treatable today. So Grant is going to, work, throughout the winter of 1884-85. He's going to gradually grow weaker. It's going to be a real roller coaster, and that the doctors actually told Grant and his family that this condition, the cancer, would have its ups and downs. There would be times where he possibly couldn't speak. He would be weaker, and then he may rebound for a while. So there was certain ups and downs with this type of cancer. So Grant is certainly his winter is certainly going to go that way. The winter of 1884-85 is going to go that way. Grant is instructed by his doctors to stop smoking his, trademark cigars. Grant, that's something that became inseparable with Grant's image, was his smoking of his cigars, which, of course they say 20 cigars a day. I'm sure he smoked enough to give himself cancer, unfortunately. But the idea was that Grant wouldn't smoke 20 a day. That's absolutely outlandish. Grant smoked maybe 4 or 5 cigars a day. And that's a lot. I mean, when you're talking about large Victorian, sized, Cuban cigars that he preferred. So I think you're looking at a man who had the willpower to stop smoking. It just wasn't, the link between smoking and cancer was just not there back then. So Grant's going to go off nearly cold turkey off of his cigars after 20 years of smoking heavily, which is amazing. I mean, again, showing that incredible willpower, trusting the doctors, showing that willpower. I think that's really indicative of his just amazing iron will. Now, Grant is going to have periods where he's despondent. He's not working on the book quite as much, but he's going to survive until the spring of 1885, and he's going to have near-death episodes that occur in this time, and it's really the doctors almost lost him at a certain point in April, and they were surprised that he bounced back. But since he did, they thought, we got to get this guy out of the city. I can't even imagine what 1885, New York City, what it would have smelled like in the summertime, much less, the heat and the smells, and it wouldn't have been good for someone in good health, much less someone in Grant's condition. So getting him out of the city was the primary focus. And so they have this offer from Mr. Drexel, who you see on the screen here, Mr. Joseph Drexel, out of the Drexel family of Philadelphia. His brother opened Drexel University. So these were great, very wealthy men, businessmen, but they were also great philanthropists, very generous men. And so Joseph Drexel knew the Grant family, and he knew Grant's situation. Everybody did. Grant was in the newspapers, headlines of every newspaper during his illness. And so Mr. Drexel happened to be involved in this recently expanded resort on Mount McGregor, north of Saratoga Springs, at about 1,000 feet elevation, up on the foothills of the Adirondack Mountains. Beautiful views of the Hudson Valley from this promontory. And there was an old hotel there, a small hotel built by the first owner, Duncan McGregor, that had been displaced by the large 100-room hotel that you see on the screen, called the Hotel Balmoral. Now, there was even train service from Saratoga Springs to this mountaintop. And that's going to be a big factor as well, because the doctor knew that they could put him on a train in New York City and have him up on this mountaintop by the afternoon. So in one single day, he could make a trip up the mountain and not have, a very difficult journey, let's say to the Western U.S. or somewhere else that they would have brought patients in Grant's situation. The other really appealing thing to Grant would have been that the promise that this building would be outfitted for his family. So members of his family would be able to be accommodated in the same house with him. And of course, that, as I mentioned earlier, was the most important thing to Grant. So they had the resort owners. The resort already billed itself as a health resort, so this was already established. People went to this place to escape hay fever. They said it was above the cholera line. Wish it was above the COVID line. But that was the whole point of this, was to get him to a healthier environment. And they knew he wouldn't survive this, but they knew he might have just enough time to finish this book. Now, the book he had started, a lot of it, they drew some of the stuff from the articles he had written in the summer of '84 into this book. But also, he had pretty much finished all of volume 1, and he was already most of the way through volume 2 by the time he went up to the cottage. But he still had some left to do, and certainly a lot of editing left to do. And so that's where he's going to make his final push, is on Mount McGregor in the foothills of the Adirondacks. As I mentioned, a place of healing connected to Saratoga Springs, another place that was known for its healing mineral waters. And so that's going to be that's going to be his final bastion, his last hope to survive long enough, and a much more pleasant place for someone in his condition. Again, the rail service, as exciting as the ride was up the mountain, but that was one of the steepest railroads built in America. So it was an incredible ride. The Mountain Railroad was quite an incredible, exciting ride. But again, Grant had other things on his mind. And again, as I mentioned before, really, Grant is sacrificing his entire last year of his life, selflessly, to take care of his family. That's his central focus. He's doing his duty, just like he had done for his country his entire life. Now he's doing his duty to his family. He shows the same resolve. He shows the same, deep commitment and perseverance that he had shown in his military career and his political career. And we see that coming out again at Grant Cottage in his final weeks. He's, the center of the family. They really revolve around him. But at the same time, they had just a really healthy, supportive relationship. He's able to have all his children there. Nellie comes back, she, from England, just to be with her father in his final months. And, he was very close with his daughter. And so that meant a lot to him. And he was able to have his grandchildren, which he loved to watch them play. and they were able to be there on the mountain with him as well, some of them. And so, you can see this photograph. This is actually taken on the porch of Grant Cottage. The individuals on the left are Grant's son's oldest son, Fred, had two children at the time, Ulysses the third on the left and Julia on the right. And the other image on the right is Grant sitting with his wife, Julia, and his daughter, Nellie, and his daughter-in-law, Ida. So they're right there with him, spending every waking moment with this man, trying to support him because he needed their support as well. His daughters-in-law would read books to him to help him remember things about the war, and his sons were sitting there, staying up late at night in the cottage, trying to edit his memoirs. It was really an amazing amount of support. But they would also sit and play games together, play cards, and try to take their minds off the anxiety. Grant always tried to hide his true condition from his family, so they wouldn't worry as much about him. One of the things I think is really endearing, I mean, Grant, as soon as he arrives, there was a covered walkway that ran up to the hotel from the train station there on the mountain. And, obviously the veterans were there ahead of time. They put up this, wonderful welcome to our hero sign for Grant. And, Grant had a great love for the veterans, and they loved him like a father. And when Grant, back in 1885, there was no Secret Service for ex-presidents for protection. And so, Grant, there was a local Civil War veteran that actually volunteered, and they set up the tent that you see here in the image. They set that up for Sam Willett, who was a Civil War veteran in his 60s, just like Grant. He had entered the war a bit late and in his 40s. And so he's set up in a tent, and he stands guard at the stairs of the cottage, because not only do you have floods of people coming to this resort to catch a glimpse of this celebrity, but the press had been keeping a 24/7 death vigil on Grant, and were camped out on the mountain. The hotel, of course, had a telegraph to send telegraphs down to New York. And so they kept around the clock watch on Grant. And so sometimes they would get a little nosy. Most of the visitors were pretty respectful. They would walk by at a distance and just take a look at Grant. But some of them would get a little bit pushy and try to, bring quack medicines, or, try to get a scoop, as a reporter. And so, Sam's job was to keep them at bay. Now, what happens is Grant, even in his weakened condition, living on borrowed time, he would still see these people walking up this covered walkway up to the hotel. And if he caught eyes with them, he would tip his hat and he would wave. And so Sam one day came to Grant's son and said, can you help me out? Your father is making my job difficult. And Fred says, well, what seems to be the problem? And he says, well, every time, your father is so friendly. He's just tipping his hat, and every time he does so, somebody wants to come and see him. And of course, Sam had to deal with that. Fred walks up to his father, sitting on the porch there of the cottage, and tells him the situation, and Grant thinks about it. And I think what he said, really, exemplifies who Grant was. It's a simple statement. He said, I don't want to be exclusive, let them come. If a group of school children wanted to give him a bouquet of flowers, someone wanted to shake his hand, he wasn't too good for that. His son said if he was a farmer in St. Louis or the president of the United States, fame and fortune never changed him. He was the same simple, modest, approachable man. A man of the people, a man that was relatable, but also a hero, to his nation. And I think that's, really how people saw Grant. And I think it endeared a lot of Americans to him. Well, I know it did, because Grant was, obviously heavily mourned. His death was. Well, I'm going to play a short clip here. Let me see here. Or actually, we're going to skip this one. We're going to go on to the next one. So the Grant is going to work on the memoirs. He's growing weaker at the cottage, and his Grant, when he found out that people were talking about secession in St. Louis, where he was living in the South before the Civil War, he was absolutely. He said it made his blood run cold to hear people casually talk about secession. Grant, like many others, had friends and family on both sides of the conflict, and so what you see is, even though Grant was in two wars, he was at heart a man of peace, and what you see is a man that uh, wasn't looking to punish. He was really looking to heal, to reunite his nation. That was his entire goal. It wasn't, it wasn't retribution. It was reconciliation. It was healing. Um, he did what he had to do to end the war as quickly as he could. But his end goal, he said later in a letter to the Secretary of War in 1865, he said, I always had the same concern for the people of the North as the people of the South. And I truly think that was, the case. And when you look at his Civil War record, you realize that is the case. So one of the people that really embodies this it was a moment at the cottage where Grant receives a visitor. Now, he received relatively few visitors. Most of the people had made their peace with him already. General Sherman, other people had made their peace, and they were letting the family kind of have the final weeks with their father and husband and grandfather. But one man asked, if he can come up, and it's somebody from Grant's past. It's General Simon Buckner, which I'm sure all of you know. Went to West Point with Grant, and they had a relationship prior to the Civil War. But Buckner was from Kentucky, and he joined the Confederacy and had to, surrender an army to Grant in 1862 at Fort Donelson. And so you have this man, a former enemy, and he comes to the cottage only 2 weeks before Grant's death. One of his, one of his last visitors there, and so Buckner is going to visit with him for about an hour, and Grant's writing on slips of paper at this time. He's lost his voice from the cancer, but he's just happy to see him, and they talk about old times, and it's this great meeting. But what's interesting is when Buckner leaves the house, the press jump on him and say, "What was the meeting about? What can you tell us?" And he said, "It was a private meeting. I'm not going to divulge." Now, Grant says to him, or sends, hears about this. He sends word to Buckner. He says, "Go ahead and give my slips of paper that he gave you to the press and have them print it. Anything to create harmony." And that was Grant's goal through the war and through the rest of his career and the rest of his life, was to see the wounds of the war healed in his nation, to see his nation reunited. And it really warmed his heart to see this outpouring of support. He was getting bags and bags of letters of support and sympathy. But it wasn't just from Northerners. It was from people from all walks of life, different races, different religions. And it really, warmed his heart. He said, "It's warmed my heart if it has not affected a cure." It really meant a lot to him to see this unity. Unity was what, one of the main focuses of Grant's life and career. It was towards unity. Now, the final victory is going to come before Grant dies, thankfully. Well, at least he's going to know about it. Mark Twain had visited Grant. They knew each other for a while before the end of Grant's life. And so Mark Twain's going to come to Grant's house in the fall of 1884. He's going to say, it was very coincidental, he's going to arrive at the house right as Grant's about to sign a contract with Century for his book in the fall of 1884. And Mark Twain comes in the house and he says, "Can I read the contract before you sign it?" And he looks it over. He says, "This is a terrible contract. You deserve so much better." And Grant said, "Well, he's a man of honor." He said, "Well, Century came to me first." And that's when Twain pulled an ace out of his pocket. He says, "Well, if you remember, General, we had lunch a few years ago, and I asked you to write your memoirs then. So technically, I came to you first." So, Grant had to, agree with the logic anyway, and eventually went with Twain's offer, and it was incredibly generous. I mean, especially given the reality that Grant was ill at the time. And so Twain was taking a big chance, but he was willing to do that. Grant was, a friend of his, and he wanted to help his family as well, the Grant family. So Twain is going to do something interesting. He's going to take and sell Grant's book, not in bookstores after it's printed, but he's going to take it and sell it door to door by subscription even before it's done. So he's actively selling this book while Grant's trying to finish it. And it's just an incredible effort. He sends out an army of book agents across the United States, and they are selling it door to door. And you can imagine the sympathy that's out there. Grant in the newspapers, his illness, details, and everything. And so the sympathy helped to sell it, even though Grant was a celebrity too. That helped. So Twain is going to arrive at the cottage for his final meeting with Grant only 3 weeks before his death. And at that meeting, Grant is going to ask him the most important thing that a dying man could ask. Is this going to take care of my family? Is this going to make the money? And that's when Twain said, General, do not worry. I've had an army of book agents out there. They have already pre-sold 100,000 copies of your book. And we're not even 2/3 of the way done. And so, at that moment, that must have been the biggest relief off of Grant's mind. That's his victory. He sees victory. And, he knew going to his grave, he had taken care of his family. And that's, must have been a huge relief to him. So at least he had that comfort. Grant's going to put down his pencil less than a week before he dies. The final photo you see of him is reading a newspaper because he's done writing. He's done writing the book at that moment. That's 4 days before his death. He's going to take one last ride to the beautiful overlook just down the hill from the cottage. He's got to be put in a wheelchair device to do that. And when they arrive back at the cottage again, it's really his last days. He'd been sleeping in chairs. They didn't want to put him back in those chairs again. So they ended up putting him into a bed in the parlor. And that's where he's going to spend his final hours. And I'm going to play a little video explaining a little bit about Grant's final moments here from in the cottage.
On July 16th, after weeks of struggling to finish his book, Grant finally put his pencil down and said, "There's nothing more I can do to it now." And from that point, Grant started to fail health-wise, and the family wanted him to be comfortable. So his son saw to the bringing down of a bed, an interesting artifact in its own right. It's a folding bed. But it was placed here in the parlor because the breezes were better. It's getting hotter. It's July now. And so the family placed their patriarch, the general, laid on this bed. He hadn't laid down flat in months. He had been sleeping in the chairs, so this must have been a great relief to him, and to know that his book was done. But more than anything, the greatest relief was just to be surrounded by his loving family here in the cottage. And so Grant slowly slipped away. One of his final sentiments really speaks to the kind of man he was. He said to his family, he whispered, in some of the final words he was able to speak were, "I don't want anyone to be concerned on my account." He was looking at the anxious faces of his family surrounding him, and all he could think of was their comfort and not his own. And so they went up to get some sleep, and the next morning, the morning of July 23rd, 1885, they came downstairs to surround their father and husband as he passed away peacefully on this bed at just after 8 in the morning, just under the portrait of Lincoln.
So Grant is going to pass away at the cottage, and there was a little bit of time that goes by where they really don't know where to bring him. There's a huge cry to have him buried in Washington, D.C., but the family wants to honor his final wishes that wherever they place him, that Julia have a place beside him. That was his only wish. They had almost a 40-year marriage that was very close, very loving. And that was his final wish. And so Julia was also going to go back and live in New York. And for those reasons, of course, New York City being the center of the world at the time as well, they chose a place called Riverside Park on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, a beautiful bluff overlooking the Hudson River. President Cleveland is going to appoint General Winfield Scott Hancock um, as the basically the organizer of the entire funeral procession from Mount McGregor to New York City, which is going to run through Albany. So they're going to have that's the only image we have of the services at the cottage. There was thousands of people went up there. Many veterans came to guard his glass top casket in the parlor. He was on the mountain for 10 days, lying in repose in the cottage parlor before they took him off the mountain on his journey to New York. And they're going to have the services there. General Sherman, General Ingalls, Mrs. Grant is going to go to the parlor for the first funeral, but she's going to stay behind. It's too much for her to go to New York and Albany. And so this is going to be a very affecting scene to watch these, Civil War veterans carry the casket of their old commander down the steps of the cottage and out to the waiting funeral train, and masses of veterans and thousands of people there on the mountaintop. Countless thousands are going to pass his casket in the state capitol in Albany. And then hundreds of thousands are going to pass his casket in City Hall. And on August 8th, they have the biggest funeral in that city's history. It was estimated at 7 miles long. General Hancock had arranged for 70,000 marchers and 500 carriages. It was a massive funeral. But all across the nation, every little church, every little hall was having a memorial service. Every little village in Grant's honor. Even European nations, capitals were having memorial services. So Grant was mourned across the nation. Now, you see in the center, there is an image. Now, that depicts some of the floral arrangements that were sent for the August 4th funeral, the first funeral at Grant Cottage. And those are still there. Those are some of the most amazing artifacts that are in the time capsule that we have as Grant Cottage. And they're amazing. They're still there 136 years later, full-size floral arrangements, the only ones of their kind that are known in the world. Grant is they're going to put him in a temporary tomb in Riverside Park made out of bricks. It was very, very fitting because when they placed him in his tomb, he's going to have General Sherman and Sheridan on one side as they're playing taps, as he's being placed inside. And Mrs. Grant, the widow, had been contacted by President Cleveland, and he asked, who would you like to have as pallbearers? And she said, I don't have a preference as to individuals, but if you're going to represent the Union, I want you to represent the Confederacy. And that was to honor her husband's, legacy. And that's what they did. They chose General Buckner and General Joe Johnston to stand beside as honorary pallbearers. And I think, that speaks volumes, and was such a sign of unity and respect there at the end. And Grant would have appreciated that. It took them 12 years, but they would build the biggest mausoleum, still to this day, the biggest mausoleum in North America, which is known as Grant's Tomb, about 150-foot tall structure, just an amazing structure, which is open to the public as a National Park Service site to this day. And that's where Julia, his loving wife, would join him in 1902. And they're both in sarcophagi, big stone boxes that you can go pretty much right up to down in the bottom of the tomb. And again, it's emblazoned on the side of his tomb, probably the most appropriate thing to put on his tomb, not the great warrior, not anything like that. It says, "Let us have peace," and that was the cry of Grant's heart. And I think that's something that gets overlooked in the idea of him being this incredible general. And I think he was truly a man that would have avoided war at all costs. He hated the results of war and what it did. But it's a lasting legacy too. I think we can look back at Grant as a general and as a president and admire his careers, but we can also look back at these intimate moments at Grant Cottage that really give us a better idea of who Grant was. After Grant died, the house was starting to fall into disrepair. Even though it was a massive attraction to the resort, people started going through there immediately. It's been open to the public for 136 years. and but it was starting to deteriorate. So they installed caretakers upstairs in the cottage. Oliver and Martha Clark that you see on the upper left. Oliver was actually a survivor, uh, almost a year at Andersonville prison camp. So he's a POW survivor from the war. And they took in a young Japanese girl that came up the mountain for tuberculosis treatment. They had a tuberculosis sanitarium built there near Grant Cottage in the early 20th century after the hotel had burned down. And so she becomes the third caretaker, and she spends 70 years on the mountain. And so these people are living upstairs in the cottage and keeping the downstairs as a museum and running the tours. It's just an amazing legacy. And now in the 80s, when the last caretaker, CA, that was the Japanese woman's name that's in the center photo, when she passed away, the Friends of Grant Cottage took over, a nonprofit in the 1980s, to make sure the place didn't close to the public. Because by then, the big facility next door was not a TB sanitarium anymore. It had become a state correctional facility, oddly enough. And they wanted to close the cottage. So the Friends of Grant Cottage, as a nonprofit, still to this day has a cooperative agreement to keep the place open. And we run the place with a small staff and a wonderful group of volunteers. Now, the amazing legacy of the veterans continued after Grant's death. They came to the mountain every year, and we still have the Sons of Union veterans come and do a flag ceremony at our signature Remembrance Day event every year. Because I think and we try to do other veterans events as well, because that really honors Grant's, love for the veterans, his care for the veterans. So we really want to keep that legacy going. And the photo you see is 1950, and those are Civil War veterans walking up to the cottage, marching up to the cottage. Most of them, I'm sure, in their 70s or 80s at that rate, at least. And the story does go on. We do tours daily, May through October. And, as you can see, these are historical photos from the 1890s as opposed to modern photos. And it's just amazing how much of a time capsule we have there. It's a relatively small space, but just amazing how original it is and how intimate some of the items are. So we are open Memorial Day through Columbus Day. We're staying open a little bit later in October this year. We have regular hours, and then we also cater to specialty visits and things like that. We can do private tours on other days as well. And it's just a wonderful place. It's got a beautiful view of the Hudson Valley, as you can see on the right. We take guided tours through. Most of our tour guides are volunteers, and they do a wonderful job of really going into more depth than I have, certainly on the objects and the interesting parts of the story there of the cottage itself. And as you can see, the cottage is still painted the same as it was in the 1880s, and it's kept just the way it was. So what you see in the cottage is what was there in 1885. But I think it really, again, what attracted me is it's relatable. It's a man. It's not the general or the president that we're really looking at here. We're looking at a man who loved his family. He was just a loving father, grandfather, and husband, and I think that's the core of our story. And I think that is a fitting memorial for General Grant. Perhaps as fitting as monuments on battlefields to the man. And so I think that's what makes it special.